Hello, my name is Dr. Joshua Swamidas. I'm here with Peaceful Science and Pierre Baldi. We're going to be talking about protein folding and AI's impact on science. And I'm really excited to introduce everyone to Dr. Pierre Baldi, who's a distinguished professor at University of California in Irvine. He is a computer scientist and really a scientist. He's really been at the forefront for several decades now of applying artificial intelligence to questions and problems in machine learning. Questions and problems in science to really advance science. So with that, Pierre, how would you introduce yourselves to people and tell them what you do and how you got to doing it?
Well, those are two different questions. I'm interested in intelligence in humans and machines. That's the broad picture. And I study artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, and I apply them to problems in the natural sciences, especially in physics, in chemistry, and biology.
Yeah. So for a lot of people, the whole idea of machine learning is really vague, right? It's not really. People know about it. They know it's something that maybe they maybe even seen in the films, or maybe they've tinkered with it a little bit through some library. How would you explain what artificial intelligence is, and then specifically the type of artificial intelligence that people are hearing a lot about in the news, deep learning?
I think if you want to simplify things, you can say that everything goes back to linear regression, which is something that everybody knows. You have a bunch of points, that's your data, and you're trying to fit a line or a plane, a linear space to those points. And almost everything that you see today in artificial intelligence and deep learning, not everything, but a good fraction, is basically an extension of that idea, where instead of using a line or a linear space, you're using a complex multidimensional surface in a complex high-dimensional space. You're trying to fit it to the data. That's what we call learning most of the
So,
time.
so for your analogy, you're talking about linear regression. So you have all these points where you have an x value, like where it is horizontally, y.
In two dimension, you have x and y values, and you're trying to fit a line to those points.
So that's all that machine learning is. That seems like a lot of hoopla about not very much.
Well, some people may agree with that. I think there is a little bit more than that, but by and large, a lot of things that you see out there is based on this idea.
So I guess what happens with machine learning is it makes it more complex. You're doing things that are more clever than just fitting a line, right?
In some cases, yes, you have reinforcement learning, you have this is supervised learning, you have unsupervised learning, you have self-supervised learning, you have a lot of things. But at the core, all the application you hear about, let's say in biomedical imaging, where you are training neural networks to recognize images and classify disease versus healthy states, most of those applications are based on this idea.
So then let's talk about this a little bit more then. So that's a pretty simple idea, but it turns out that you can do some pretty complex and difficult things with it, right? And
Correct.
and one of the things that was just in the news recently, we're not going to spend all of our time talking about this, but it's an important what's the right word? Important thing well, like I said, it's in the news and people are curious about it. Is this thing called AlphaFold, and they was trying to do protein folding, and you've even done some work in protein folding. So we talked a little bit about artificial intelligence and what that is. Let's talk about the protein folding problem, and then talk about how those things kind of come together, as just one example of how AI is being used in science. So what is the protein folding problem, or at least one example of it?
So proteins are basically polymeric molecules that are made by a sequence of amino acids. There are 20 naturally occurring amino acids. And these sequences, they fold in complex 3D shapes, which are essential for their function, for which other molecules they can interact with and bind to. And you can view protein as being sort of the intelligent processors of life. They carry all the functions that living cells have to carry. And so for instance, you have proteins that can bind to oxygen and carry oxygen in the blood hemoglobin or store oxygen in muscles, myoglobin, right? So basically, you have these sequences that have variable length, but typically, a few hundred to a few thousand amino acids.
So, and we represent this as letters. So you basically have like a long
You have a long
string
string. It's
of letters.
gibberish, but basically it's a long string over an alphabet that has 20 letters. That represents what is called the primary sequence of the protein chain. Each letter is, of course, a small molecule with something like on the order of 15 atoms or so. And these sequences fold into a complex 3D structure. And so the protein folding problem or the protein structure prediction problem, in essence, is the problem of predicting this 3D structure, which means giving the XYZ coordinates of all the atoms in the structure.
So it's kind of like we have like a ribbon where there's like different colors along it, or like a string of beads, right? And they're going to kind of form up again into some knot or some big glob of stuff in 3D coordinates. And the trick is to take that sequence of amino acids and figure out what the shape is for that final.
Correct. And there are many different facets to the problem. You can predict secondary structure, which is the location of different structural motifs along the protein sequence. You can predict tertiary structure at the level of the backbone, the rough 3D shape. There is the side chains, that means assigning coordinates to all the atoms in each one of the amino acids along the backbone. And you can even go to quaternary structure where you have different proteins that are coming together and forming a complex. And you want to know, ideally, the XYZ coordinates of all the atoms in the complex.
And there's also trying to predict how it might even move and shape in different alternate conformations. So it's a pretty complex, it's maybe multiple problems.
It's multiple problems. There is disagreement as to whether the 3D structure is always well defined. Proteins have some mobility. There are disorder regions. I mean, it is a complex problem with many facets.
So it's complex. It's also a hard problem, right?
It is a hard problem. It has been around since the 60s when people discovered that proteins could have a somewhat well-defined structure through a variety of experiments. You can experimentally determine the structure using X-ray diffraction, crystallography with X-ray diffraction. There are other methods, NMR, etc. So there are ways for determining the structure of a protein, and there are databases containing solved structures.
And that actually ends up being important because that data ends up being kind of like the plots on the graph where you can maybe fit that line to figure out where another point.
That's what machine learning needs, of course, is data where you know the answer, the ground truth somehow, so that you can use that to try to learn the algorithm for folding proteins.
And so AlphaFold was a deep learning algorithm, and it was trying to solve this problem. And a lot of people think it did really well. There was a competition called CASP that you participated in a long time ago. You don't really do that anymore. There's been other things that have been occupying your time. But there's hundreds of people across the world that really will submit results from their algorithms to really try and predict a new structure or a couple new structures, right? Now, AlphaFold was a type of deep learning algorithm, but help walk someone new to this through about how actually you get from fitting a line to going from a sequence to a structure. I mean, what's that about? How does that happen? It seems like you took something very simple, but this is a lot more complex.
Right. So this problem has a long history. So the first application of deep learning or neural network to protein structure prediction is in the 80s, as far as I know, by Kian and Sinowski, where they started working on the problem of predicting secondary structure. So if you're trying to predict secondary structure, you're just going from a string from the original sequence, which is a string over a 20-letter alphabet, to a string of the same length, but over a 3-letter alphabet. The 3-letter represent alpha helices, beta strands, and coils, which are the 3 main structural motifs that occur in proteins. So that was the first application of neural networks to that problem. At the time, they were getting an accuracy in the mid 60s type of accuracy. And then in the 1990s, Roast and Sander improved on that and got the accuracy to the 74%, something like that, etc. And then in the late 90s, 2000, we started developing new deep learning methods based on recursive neural networks, walking the protein sequence from both ends using these recursive deep learning methods. And to make a long story short, the accuracy today on secondary structure prediction is around 95% correct. So secondary structure prediction is solved.
Wow.
Now, to solve 3D structure, which is a much harder problem, one possibility is to use contact maps. Because the structure of a protein is invariant under rotations and translation. If you move the protein
So a
around,
contact map is basically you take every single letter and you try and predict how far apart they are
correct. So
in 3D space, and then use that to construct the 3D structure. Is that right?
that is correct. Because, I mean, if you're trying to predict, if you start from the sequence and you want to predict XYZ coordinate immediately, you do have the problem that as you move the protein around in space or you rotate it, the structure remains the same, but the coordinates are changing wildly, right? So you either have to define a fixed rigid frames that you use for all the proteins, which is a little bit artificial because there is no such natural frame, or you have to represent the protein in a way that doesn't depend on rotation and translation. And one way to do so is the contact map. So the contact map is basically a matrix that looks at letter I and letter J in the sequence and tells you yes or no, I and J are close to each other in space, in 3D space, when the protein falls or not, right?
And then you basically use that information to somehow reconstruct the structure, which is
Right.
another.
If you have a good contact map, there are methods for going from the contact map to the 3D structure up to mirror symmetries and little details like that. So
Okay.
that's one possible pipeline, is to start from the sequence, predict the contact map, and then go from contact map to 3D coordinates
So that's
in
so that's
some reference frame.
that's I think one of the tricks that AlphaFold used, and it's not really precisely about AlphaFold, except for the fact that they got some pretty big improvements. Why did they get those improvements? Do you think, or do?
Well, first of all, let me say that I haven't seen any papers from
That's
AlphaFold.
true.
I don't know the detail. I've read, of course, what's in the news, but I don't know in details what they did for the current CASP. I've seen what they did 2 years ago. But so the idea of using contact maps and applying deep learning to contact maps is also not new.
Yeah,
My,
I did that. I saw that in your group back in
yeah, we did
like
this
15 years ago, right?
15 years ago, refined it, and other groups have worked on this. So the basic ideas are not really new, but from the result at CAST, which is this blind prediction experiment that takes place every 2 years, from what I've seen in the news, the AlphaFold system was getting the best results and results that seem to be indicate that at least for the test proteins of CASP, they were getting results close to crystal X-ray diffraction accuracy. So
Yeah,
really
yeah.
within a few angstrom from the true structure.
Of course, it's not a solved problem then, because these are particular proteins. We haven't seen the paper yet. Also, the protein folding problem is really complex. I mean, it doesn't even touch on the quaternary problem or how
Yes,
multiple
there is
proteins are.
a problem. There is the problem of disorder regions. Proteins that do seem not to have a well-defined structure or that fluctuate between different structures. There is the problem of how biased is the sample used for training or for cast testing. We don't really know what is the structure of the universe of protein structures, right? We just know the samples that have been solved so far. So there is questions there. Maybe there are new classes of proteins that we don't know very well, on which current algorithms could may do well or may not. We don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So I think so that's basically what happened. So there is we talked about what deep learning is, what protein folding is, and what happened is that there was some improvements recently in how we can predict that. So let's let's shift from AlphaFold particularly, and I wanted to because you've been working in protein folding for a while, but you moved out of just the competition to actually trying to apply these to actually solve real scientific problems uh, and really further scientific understanding in particular areas. So, what will we do with a useful protein structure prediction model? What will be useful about it? What are some of the things that maybe you've even done and played with?
Not me, but I mean, if you ask scientists, you will see a variety of opinion. Some people think that this is really a game changer. I've seen those
Yeah,
in the literature, and some people think that this is not a big deal, right?
yeah.
Probably the truth is somewhere in between. You can imagine that if there is a group that has been working on a particular protein and it's particularly difficult to crystallize and to study experimentally, maybe having a good prediction can help that group in both designing experiments, in testing drugs, etc. So for some projects, such a tool could be useful. There is no question about that.
So we're hearing more about machine learning and artificial intelligence and deep learning a lot right now. Why is that? Why is it really? Why is that happening right now? Is it just a fad? Is there a reason why people know about it more now than they did 10 years ago? Or is it really just continuing the same pattern, or has there been some big changes over those last 10 years?
Well, it depends what you're measuring. It is true that you're seeing AI and deep learning, in the news all the time, penetrating all kinds of areas. Um, in terms of the fundamental ideas, there is no major breakthrough. The basic ideas were developed a long time ago, in the 80s, if not before. I could, go over some of the history. What is making a big difference is GPUs, the computational power that you have now available to you to train large systems that was not available, let's say, in the 90s. And
So increased computational power, and particularly, graphic
GPUs, yeah, I
processing units.
think,
Yeah.
in my opinion, that is the main driving factor. But you also have very good software libraries that have been developed by companies, by Google, Facebook, etc. Things like PyTorch, TensorFlow, etc., which are robust and maintained by industry. And those are very widely used and very useful. Students can pick up, can learn how to train, deep learning models relatively easily now. There are plenty of tutorials. And then, of course, the third element is the data availability, etc. So we have an explosion of sensors and all kinds of databases, etc. So in some area, data is plentiful. In other areas, there is not so much data. So there's a huge variability, but the general trend is for data expansion in many areas.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. Some people said that they're having a hard time hearing me. Hopefully, you can hear me a little bit better now. So I think that aspect of the software is really interesting because back when I was in my PhD, we actually had to hand code quite a bit of stuff that ends up being trivial now. I mean, do you even teach it to students how to do that anymore?
Well, when I teach the deep learning class, we definitely have an introduction to some of those tools. But very rarely, when you're doing something that is a little bit theoretical or something that not many people are doing, you do need to code your own stuff. That happens sometimes. But for all the basic application, let's say deep learning for biomedical imaging, everything is available. And not only you have the software available, but you have pre-trained models that are available.
Yeah, yeah. So then it ends up being really faster computer power, better software, and then also data, right? That ends up becoming another thing that's really different right now.
As I said, the amount of data varies a lot across different problems, different fields. So that in the short term, that creates both challenges and opportunities, depending on how much data there is in a particular area or problem.
Yeah, so in a lot, I think there's also another aspect too of people actually know about it more. and it's more recognized as a real thing.
Some levels of deep learning and AI are becoming like a commodity, right?
Yeah. Where I remember when I was on the job market 10 years ago, people didn't really know what it was that I was doing. Now everyone does, which is really good in some ways. Also, it's also bad in other ways. There's a lot of people out there doing things that maybe aren't always as good too. But you have a new book coming out on deep learning and science, right?
Correct. Yes, will come out in March with Cambridge University Press.
So how is deep learning actually impacting science? How would you explain it? Or how is it being used? Or what is the relationship between deep learning and science?
Well, if you think of deep learning as linear regression can be applied everywhere in science. You can apply it in psychology, in economics, in chemistry. It doesn't matter. It's linear regression, right? And the same, to a large extent, the same is occurring with deep learning. So I've been very fortunate to be able to apply deep learning in biology, in chemistry, in physics, across a variety of problems, but it's essentially the same core technology that you apply to different types of data, different data sets, in collaboration with experts from the target fields. That's very important.
So what's one of the more interesting case studies you could share with us that you thought was really cool?
I'll give you two extreme examples. One very interesting problem is the prediction of chemical reactions in organic chemistry, say.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult problem. The biggest challenge there is the data. There is no publicly available database of all known chemical reactions.
The American Chemical Society has one, but they don't really let you have it, right?
Exactly. Most universities have a license to that, but you can only access through their interface, so you can query the database, one query at a time. But of course, for machine learning, that's not what you need. You need to have all the data in the machine so that you can train systems. So that's a very interesting problem. It has a symbolic component. It has all kinds of interesting aspects. It's very challenging. So we've been working on that for a couple of decades. That's one example. Another example that I can give you is applications in physics, moving away from biology. So in physics, you have all kinds of very large experiments with very complex instruments, the biggest instruments built by mankind, whether it's telescopes in space or a Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland. And basically, you have these very complex detectors, but at the end of the day, what they produce are images. You have collisions of particles, they produce a shower, and that's what the detectors around the point of collision detect. So you get these images which are not humanly interpretable. They look very strange, but at the end of the day, they are images. Different detectors produce different types of images, different geometries, different types of particles. That's fine. But again, you have images, and from there, you want to do things like classification or regression, right? Tell me whether a Higgs boson was produced in the collision or not. Tell me what was the energy of a certain neutrino in a particular event, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see all those problems where deep learning methods can be applied.
So those are cases also. There's a lot of data, just an immense amount of data, because when you spend that much money building an instrument, you make sure you store all the data you collect, right?
There is a lot of data, but there too, you can imagine that these large instruments, they have consortiums around them that are controlling the data. So it's not that you can say, hey, let me go through the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, and try my little neural network on that. It's again, a very complex political process, but you also have simulators, and you can use simulated data, which is a little bit more readily available. So what a lot of us are doing are first developing methods on the simulated data in collaboration with physicists, and then little by little try to push the methods into the actual experiments, either directly or through collaborations, etc. So
for example, to kind of break it down in a simple way, it'd be like if you were trying to detect a new type of particle, maybe you'd simulate what it would supposed to be looking like in LHC. you build something that could basically learn from looking at a lot of examples. Oh, that's actually what particle, the Baldi particle looks like.
Swamida's particle.
The sawdust particle, yeah. And then you take that and you apply it to data from the actual experiment to see, did you see any evidence of that? And that might actually end up working a lot better than a lot more of the standard methods that have been really used.
Absolutely.
Now, when people think about artificial intelligence, though, they're thinking about things that can be a lot smarter than just that, right?
Of course.
So one way how people think about artificial intelligence isn't as just tools for doing pattern recognition like you're talking about, but they're encountering or wondering about, whether or not they'd ever be able to sit down and talk to an AI. And if it actually has a mind. And sometimes people call that general AI. Do you think we'll ever see a general AI?
That is a good question. What I think is that all the prediction that general AI will happen in 2025 or anything like, in the very near future, I think they are completely off. And there is a lot of hype and misinformation out there and misrepresentation. So it's a very noisy space. But I don't think we are anywhere near our general artificial intelligence.
What about like 40 years from now or 50 years from now?
It's very dangerous to make predictions, so I'm not making predictions, but I can tell you that, the fundamental question behind all this is whether general intelligence and consciousness are possible or not in digital machine, in our silicon-based machines, right?
And we don't really know the answer to that question.
We don't really know the answer, and I think we don't even have good clues about the answer. And up to a few years ago, I was in the camp that thought that clearly it must be possible, and it's going to take some time, but we'll get there. But I have some doubts now, and I've been starting looking at other things, and there is all kinds of theory and
tell me about those, like
quantum mechanics, etc. So this is what really interests me now, and I'm studying those things. But I don't have any results or any new insights.
But what gives you the doubts? Is it the idea that maybe consciousness needs to be in a more analog system instead of digital, or something that's more connected to fundamental?
For me, studying physics, talking to physicists, looking at what's going on in physics, the mysteries of physics, the problem of unifying the standard model with general relativity, the ideas of Penrose. The quantum computing, which is something that we see coming. Quantum computing, quantum computers will become a reality, in the next decades or so. And other connected theories. All that is behind.
But I think you're right, though. I don't think anyone really knows the answer. So if you're predicting that it's around the corner, I don't think we know how consciousness really arises. I don't think we know really.
That is absolutely correct. There is no good theory of that. Of course, there is no good definition of consciousness. But all the theory. You look at neuroscience, you look at philosophy, you look right and left. There is no theory. It's easy to say it emerges from neural networks, from deep learning, from whatever algorithms you want, but it means nothing. So we don't have theory. Yes.
I think one of the more fundamental issues here, let's say we even made an intelligent machine, how would we even know if it was intelligent? I mean, the Turing test doesn't really work for that, right?
Well, again, intelligence, consciousness, those are just words that are not well defined. But intuitively, I think the Turing test, a lot of lay people would be satisfied if they saw a machine that can pass the Turing test.
But that's not enough, right? That's not enough to really settle the question, is it? So Turing test, just to be clear for people listening, that's like it's the idea if you could get a machine that just fooled people to think that it was actually another person, then you actually have something that passes the Turing test. But does that really mean it has consciousness? Because it's actually maybe even more believable to think a machine could pass at least limited Turing tests, right?
You're asking a very difficult question. You are trying to separate consciousness from general intelligence, which is a fine question. But again, we don't know what intelligence is. We don't know consciousness. You want to separate them. It's really, this is better for cocktails, right?
Well, Yeah, well, that's kind of what this is. This is us kind of, having a drink after work and talking like we have over the years.
Okay.
I think, I mean, it is an interesting question. I mean, I think that's how a lot of people enter into artificial intelligence. But I think the reality of it is far more mundane in some ways, but it ends up being really, really useful. I got to say, I've been really surprised,
You take
nonetheless.
general artificial intelligence,
What's
right?
that?
Let's take general artificial
Okay.
intelligence. It really means nothing, because what do you really mean by general artificial intelligence? I mean, you want something that can make airplane reservations for you, etc. But what about proving Fermat's last theorem? Is that part of general intelligence? I mean, how far you want to push it, right? Uh,
Yeah, I think. I mean,
is it something that behaves like an average human being, or is it something that behaves better than any human being in any possible dimension, right? That's
yeah, I think
difficult.
ultimately, here, let's see this. People are saying that they can't hear me. Hopefully, you guys can hear me better now. But yeah, I agree with you that uh, that that it's hard to define what intelligence is. But I think fundamentally, if we ever do get a machine with consciousness, it's not going to have intelligence like we have. It's not going to be quite like us, right? I mean, unless we choose to make it like us somehow and can, its experience of the world will be very, very different than ours. It wouldn't have parents, for example. It wouldn't have a body quite like ours. It wouldn't. I mean, who knows, right? In some ways, but there's no reason to think that it would be quite like us. I mean, its experience would be very different. But you're right. I mean, now we're getting into the science fiction realm. I think the reality is that deep learning and machine learning have really been in a different place. So I gotta say, as a person who's been working in this field for a while, I've been really surprised at how much things have advanced over the last 10 years. If you look at some of the things that are possible now with machine learning, and sometimes even commoditized in image processing and language processing, I wouldn't have predicted this is where we'd be 10 years from now. Uh, has that been your experience too? Are you surprised where things have gone, or are you?
I am not surprised at all, because in fact, already in the 90s, we sort of knew that. People tell you there was no neural networks in the 90s, or you could not train deep neural networks because of something like vanishing gradients, etc.
Oh, that's solvable. Yeah.
All that is nonsense.
Yeah.
We were training neural networks with hundreds of layers on secondary structure prediction, for instance, in the late 90s. So a lot of the history, a lot of what you see is distorted by all kinds of phenomena. But it's not it's not surprising. Maybe what is surprising is why it was delayed by 5 or 10 years. It could have happened earlier.
You think it could have happened earlier? Like what?
Yeah, of course, of
Yeah.
course.
Well, I think the part that was surprising for me isn't, yeah, so the methodology maybe has been there for a while. But I would say the degree to which it's entered society in different places everywhere, really, and also how effective certain things have been that you just wouldn't have expected to have been to have worked so well at this stage. At least I wouldn't have. I mean, natural language processing was a really hard problem, and it's not solved yet, right? But we're certainly. I mean, what the algorithms are capable of now are just leaps and bounds ahead of what they were able to 10 years ago. I mean, imaging processing is another example too. And then obviously playing games as well too. That's another really interesting place. So I know a long time ago you did some work on the problem of Go and how to actually play Go. But then now they even have algorithms that can, based on looking at the video screen, play video games too, which is pretty. It's not an easy task. It's a large number of things that need to happen to make that happen. You're really saying that none of that's been surprising? How far we've gotten now? It's really surprises. Why did it take so long?
That is my personal take. Yes.
All right. Well, I guess maybe.
I've been working on deep learning since the 80s, right? I'm one of those few people. So.
Well, that's great.
We
I mean, like I said, I've been surprised. I've been encouraged in a lot of ways, but maybe I've been more negative even about general AI than you have in the past, and maybe more open to it now too. But who knows? I mean, in the end, no one really knows the answer to that question.
I think
But
it won't happen by 2025. I'm willing
oh,
to.
that I agree with. I mean, who really thinks it's going to be by 2025 right now? Does anyone?
There's many people. I've seen even interviews of Elon Musk. There is an interview of him I've seen.
But that's Elon Musk. I mean,
The singularity, people call it the singularity, and it was predicted to happen 5 years ago, etc. Current estimates I've seen 2025, but it's not going to happen.
yeah, I agree with you on that. Anyhow, I really want to thank you for coming and talking with us, Pierre. I think it's a real privilege to be able to kind of get you out of the lab for a little bit to talk about it, and I think that there's just a lot of really interesting questions, as you say, that probably are better suited for just kind of grabbing a beer and talking about too. And I think that's been part of the fun of doing this, is that it's technically interesting and important. It really does advance science, and I've really been enjoying applying it in areas adjacent to yours, but a little different. And there's a real opportunity to learn and play a lot more as time goes on too. So we'll get to see where it is. Maybe I'm curious to see if 10 years from now, whether or not you're surprised by where things have gone. But it sounds like maybe you're ready to see it all happen, and maybe why didn't happen 10 years ago. So I guess we'll find out, and maybe I'll be surprised too, or maybe not. We'll see. Anyhow, thanks a lot. I'm gonna close our broadcast. We'll just chat a little bit more, and